Yeah, I mean, I most recently spent the last couple of weeks in Maryland with the governor, who's fantastic, and we are working on trying to
I live in
pull.
Maryland.
Oh, you do? Okay. Wes is an unbelievable human being, and very exciting to see new leadership in Maryland. But we've been working on trying to pull in and get the increase to 15 done by September, and then index minimum wage going forward to inflation. But something we don't need to get into too much today. I think. Look, I think one thing I'll tell you, and this is a good sort of example, is some of the smartest CEOs that I know that run some of the biggest companies, especially in food, they weren't talking about in 2019, they weren't talking about wages, they weren't talking about reshuffling the deck and what it's going to take to bring workers back into their business. They weren't talking about reducing hours of operation because they couldn't staff, right, their location. They were pretty far behind as it relates to what it means to be a good employer, what it means to be a good jobs employer. When I say good jobs, it doesn't mean that my perspective on good jobs is different. It's what's going to influence the P&L. If you're purely thinking about profitability, you're thinking about 1 to 2 years out, right? There are obvious things that you're going to do to make yourself a good jobs employer. Their head was in the sand, and some of the smartest people I know. And so I think part of government's job is to help and those CEOs. And if the smartest CEOs in the world's head in the sand, what do you think that means for the mom and pop, right? Who may not even be thinking remotely close to or being professionally trained on what it means to run a business at all. And so I think it's more of like guardrails or kind of like guideposts around where do we need to be going and how do we think about that from an education standpoint, because even if you think your finger's on the pulse, like you could be missing. And so it's this notion of education. And I think minimums are extremely helpful. Minimums are maximums. It's not saying this is what you have to pay. It's saying this is the baseline of what you need to pay. I think it's extremely good. I think it's extremely healthy. I think, we've learned that, regulation even more recently, right? The rolling back of Dodd-Frank, and what did that do? But regulation's helpful, right? Again, it helps us understand the playing field. No one wants to go play basketball in the pickup court without a referee, right? I'll walk three blocks down the street where I live in New York, and it's like there isn't a game that occurs without a fight, right? And it's just like guys chomping each other. It's because we need the referee. We need to understand the rules, and I think that's what makes America so great, is that we have a set of rules that we all can play by. And I think government's intervention in things like wages and healthcare and childcare, women's rights, these are important things, because without it, we're a little bit lost. And like I said, smartest people I know, they get lost as well. And so I think it's really helpful that we all understand where we should be. We're indexing our companies against that. There are minimums that help guide policy internally in the boardroom and HR policy. And it helps us think about making sure that we don't get stuck in the mud, and that we don't have a policy that 10 years later finds us irrelevant and losing jobs and losing market share because we couldn't see 10 years out that wages were going to step up on average by $3 or $4 because there's a global pandemic and you have to pay people more to incentivize them to get to work. That's a classic example of like it broke down. And so my perspective is it's all good. And entrepreneurs, small business, big business, we all understand that, CEOs as well. It's our job to navigate, right, anything thrown at us. And labor has been one of those things that hasn't changed for outside of maybe Silicon Valley and engineering. And it just hasn't changed for a long time in retail and restaurants. And now we're going through that disruption. And we're all now looking in the mirror, coming up with different solutions. And those of us that were further ahead, and quite frankly, the minimum wage was further ahead, it wouldn't be nearly the issue that it is. It just wouldn't be, right? Businesses in New York are not scratching their heads saying, how do I pay $18 an hour to incentivize the workforce, because they've been doing that because the minimum wage in New York City has been there. So that's a good example. I think we need it. It's critically important. And this is coming from a person who doesn't love, government intervention, everything. It's helpful. It gets everyone on the same playing field. It strips out an area that we're all scratching our heads saying, what's the right or wrong thing to do? And it helps guide businesses forward, I think, in a very healthy way.